Millionaire lost his beloved in a tragic accident. 25 years later, he was paralyzed when he saw a humble farmer identical to her. He approached. Howard Caldwell stood by the large window of his mansion in Riverbend, staring out at the empty gardens below. The autumn sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the immaculate lawn. But the beauty of the scene didn't touch him. It hadn't in years. Everything around him felt hollow, just like his life. The loss of Margaret, his wife, 25 years ago had left him a broken man, and no amount of time, success, or money could fill the void she left behind. His mansion, grand and opulent, was more like a mausoleum now, filled with memories of a life he no longer lived. Every room held pieces of Margaret, the piano she used to play in the evenings, the garden she lovingly tended to, and the photographs that still lined the walls. They were both a comfort and a curse. Howard couldn't bring himself to remove them, yet each glance at her smiling face was a reminder of the life they could have had if she hadn't been taken from him so suddenly. Margaret had been the love of his life, the one who made everything make sense. Her death in that tragic car accident had shattered him. She was vibrant, full of life, always the light in any room. Without her, Howard had become a shadow of himself. His heart had turned cold, and he withdrew from the world, focusing only on his businesses. The empire he built continued to grow, but it felt like a mechanical process, devoid of any true purpose. He often asked himself what his wealth meant without someone to share it with. For years, Howard had thrown himself into work, not because he wanted more success, but because it was the only way to keep the crushing silence at bay. When he wasn't working, his thoughts would drift back to Margaret, how she laughed, how she made him feel like the richest man in the world even before his bank accounts overflowed. The house was eerily quiet now, the ticking of the grandfather clock the only sound in the vast, empty space. He sipped his whiskey slowly, letting the warmth of the drink distract him, if only for a moment. But even the burn in his throat couldn't numb the ache in his chest. Howard walked over to the mantel, where an old photograph of him and Margaret sat, dusted regularly by the housekeeper, but never moved. They were young in the picture, standing in front of a field of sunflowers during a summer trip. Her head was thrown back in laughter, her hand resting on his arm as she leaned into him. He could still hear that laugh if he let himself remember it, but it was painful to do so. It was easier to shut it out, to build walls around his heart and live in the coldness he had grown used to. As he stared at the photograph, he wondered if he would ever feel anything close to that happiness again. He doubted it. Margaret had been his everything, and without her, he had nothing. Relationships, love, they were for other people, not for him, not anymore. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. It was Lillian, his longtime housekeeper, and one of the few people who had stayed by his side through the years. "Mr. Caldwell," she said softly, her voice full of the careful sympathy she had learned to use around him. "Dinner is ready if you'd like to eat now." Howard nodded without turning around. "I'll be there in a minute," he replied, his voice low and rough. Lillian hesitated for a moment, as if she wanted to say something more, but then she simply turned and left the room. She knew better than to try to comfort him. After all these years, there was nothing anyone could say that would change the fact that Margaret was gone and she wasn't coming back. Howard sighed heavily, placing the photograph back on the mantel. He didn't have much of an appetite, but he ate because it was expected of him. Routine kept him functioning, if you could call his life functioning. He moved through his days with a mechanical precision, checking off tasks, making decisions, and maintaining the appearance of a man in control. But inside, Howard was a wreck, and he knew it. After a moment longer, he left the room, making his way down the wide, empty hallway toward the dining room. The walls were adorned with more photos of him and Margaret, snapshots of a life filled with love, laughter, and promise. But each image now felt like a cruel reminder of what had been stolen from him. He couldn't escape it, not even in his own home. As he sat down at the long dining table, a plate of food was placed in front of him, Howard barely noticed what it was. He ate in silence, his mind far away, lost in the past. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't move forward. It was as if Margaret's ghost haunted every corner of his life, keeping him tied to a time that no longer existed. Tomorrow, he thought, would be just another day, another endless repetition of the same hollow routine. But for tonight, all he could do was get through it, one lonely minute at a time. Howard Caldwell rarely ventured outside his tightly controlled world of business and isolation. But when his assistant suggested he take a personal look at a potential land purchase in Willow Creek, something about the idea tugged at him. He wasn't sure why, but there was a part of him that felt restless. Perhaps it was the monotony of his life, or the constant ache of Margaret's absence. Whatever it was, Howard found himself agreeing, and soon he was on the road, driving through unfamiliar rural landscapes toward a town he had never heard of. Willow Creek was nothing like the bustling city where Howard lived. It was quiet, peaceful, and green, with rolling hills and a small river running through it. The air was fresh, and the simplicity of the town stood in stark contrast to the towering skyscrapers and concrete streets of Riverbend. As he pulled into the town, Howard felt an odd sense of calm wash over him, though he didn't know why. The property he was looking at was on the outskirts of the town, a small farm that his business advisors thought could be useful for a future development project. Howard had agreed to check it out himself, but in truth, his mind was only half on the deal. The other half was still stuck in the past, replaying memories of Margaret, as it so often did. He arrived at the farm mid-afternoon. The sun was warm, casting a golden light over the fields. Howard parked his car and stepped out, taking in the sight of the land. It was well kept, with rows of crops stretching out toward the horizon, and a charming old farmhouse sitting proudly at the center. There was something about the place that felt timeless. As he approached the house, he saw her. For a moment, Howard froze. His heart skipped a beat, and he felt a rush of confusion, followed quickly by a flood of emotions he hadn't experienced in years. Standing just beyond the fence, tending to a patch of flowers, was a woman who looked exactly like Margaret. His breath caught in his throat. It couldn't be possible. His mind had to be playing tricks on him. Yet there she was, moving with the same grace, the same quiet elegance that Margaret had always carried. She was dressed simply, in jeans and a flannel shirt, her hair pulled back into a loose ponytail, but her face was identical to the woman he had loved and lost. Howard stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to move or speak. He didn't know what to do. His rational mind told him it was impossible, that this was just a coincidence. But the resemblance was so striking, so uncanny, that for a brief, heart-wrenching moment, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Margaret had somehow come back to him. The woman straightened up from her work and turned, finally noticing Howard standing by the fence. She smiled politely, but there was no recognition in her eyes. Of course there wasn't. She wasn't Margaret. "Hello?" she called out, wiping her hands on a cloth before walking over to him. "Can I help you with something?" Her voice was different from Margaret's, softer and more hesitant, but there was still that strange, almost otherworldly familiarity that sent Howard's heart racing. He struggled to find his words. I'm here to inquire about the property," he managed to say, though his voice sounded distant, even to his own ears. "My name is Howard Caldwell." The woman nodded, her expression friendly but cautious. "I see. I'm Grace," she introduced herself, extending a hand. "This is my farm." Howard shook her hand, still in shock. Grace, even the name seemed like some cruel twist of fate. Simple, beautiful, like the woman standing before him. "I've heard someone was interested in buying the land," Grace continued, her tone businesslike now, though still warm. "But I'll tell you right away, I'm not selling. This place has been in my family for generations, and I plan to keep it that way." Howard nodded, his mind still reeling. He hadn't come here expecting to close a deal today, but neither had he expected this. How could this be real? How could this woman look so much like Margaret and yet be someone entirely different? "I understand," he said, regaining some of his composure. "I won't push you to sell. I just wanted to see the place for myself." Grace looked at him curiously, as if sensing that there was more to his visit than he was letting on. "You don't look like the type who comes out to rural properties often," she said, smiling gently. "What brings you all the way out here?" Howard hesitated. What could he say? That he was here because she looked like a ghost from his past? That he had been struck speechless by her resemblance to a woman he had loved and lost decades ago? No, he couldn't say that. He could hardly explain it to himself, let alone to a stranger. "I've been looking at some properties for future projects," he finally said, keeping his tone neutral. "But you're right, this isn't my usual setting." Grace chuckled softly. "Well, if you're looking for quiet, you've found the right place. Willow Creek doesn't get much busier than this." Howard smiled faintly, though his thoughts were still spinning. He glanced around, trying to focus on anything other than the way Grace's eyes, her smile, her entire presence seemed to mirror Margaret's in ways that felt impossible. The resemblance was too much for coincidence. But how? "Do you live here alone?" Howard asked, the question slipping out before he could stop himself. He needed to know more about her, who she was, where she had come from. Grace nodded. "Mostly. I take care of my niece, Ellie, since my sister passed away. It's just the two of us now." Howard's heart ached at the mention of loss. He knew that kind of pain all too well. But there was something else. Something about the way Grace spoke of her family that pulled at him in a different way. He wanted to know more, to understand who she was and why she looked so much like the woman he had spent his life mourning. "Well, Grace," he said, after a moment's pause, "I'd like to learn more about your farm. Maybe we can talk?" Grace glanced at the setting sun before nodding. "I suppose we could. Why don't you come inside? We can sit and talk over some coffee." Howard agreed, his mind swirling with questions as he followed her toward the farmhouse. Every step felt like he was stepping deeper into a mystery, one that would change everything. The farmhouse smelled of fresh coffee and worn wood as Howard followed Grace inside. It was small and cozy, a stark contrast to the cold, cavernous halls of his mansion in Riverbend. The walls were lined with family photos, the kind that told the story of a life filled with simple pleasures and close bonds. It wasn't hard to imagine Grace sitting at the table with her family, sharing meals, laughing, and talking about their day. The warmth of the place was palpable, almost foreign to Howard, whose home had long since lost any sense of life. Grace gestured for him to sit at the table while she busied herself in the kitchen, preparing 2 cups of coffee. Howard glanced around the room, noting the little details: the vase of wildflowers on the windowsill, the stack of books on a nearby shelf, the faint sound of country music playing softly from a radio in the corner. Everything here felt lived in, real, and it made him realize just how empty his own life had become. Grace returned with the coffee, setting a cup in front of Howard before taking a seat across from him. She folded her hands on the table, looking at him with a mixture of curiosity and kindness. It was the same look Margaret used to give him when she was trying to figure out what was on his mind. The familiarity of it unsettled him, and for a moment, Howard wasn't sure if he was sitting across from Grace or some ghostly version of Margaret. "So," Grace began, taking a sip of her coffee, "what's your real reason for being here, Mr. Caldwell?" Howard blinked, startled by the directness of her question. He wasn't sure how to answer. The truth was too complicated, too raw. He couldn't just tell her that she looked exactly like the woman he'd loved and lost. He couldn't even explain it to himself. "I'm interested in your property," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "It has potential for a development project I'm working on." Grace raised an eyebrow, her expression skeptical but not unkind. "Potential for what exactly?" "This is a small farm, not exactly prime real estate for big business. Howard took a deep breath, leaning back in his chair. It's not about the size. It's about the location. Willow Creek is growing. And I think there's an opportunity here for something different. Grace smiled slightly, but there was a firmness in her gaze that told Howard she wasn't convinced. Mr. Caldwell, I appreciate your interest, but this farm isn't for sale. Her words were gentle, but they struck Howard like a blow. He hadn't expected to close the deal today, but the finality in her voice made it clear that no amount of money would change her mind. And yet, there was something about her resolve that fascinated him, just as much as her resemblance to Margaret did. This place has been in my family for generations, Grace continued, her tone softening as she glanced around the room. It's more than just land to me. It's my home, my connection to my parents, and now it's Ellie's home too. I couldn't sell it, not for any price. Howard nodded, though inside he was reeling. It wasn't often that people said no to him, especially not with such conviction. He had built his empire by knowing what people wanted and finding a way to give it to them, often for his own benefit. But Grace didn't seem motivated by the things that usually swayed people. Money, power, influence. None of it mattered to her. Her attachment to the farm was personal, emotional, and that made it a much harder obstacle to overcome. I understand, he said after a pause, his voice calm. I respect your decision. Grace looked at him, surprised by his response. She had probably expected him to push harder, to offer more money or try to convince her with promises of a better future. But Howard had no interest in fighting her on this. Something about Grace, her quiet strength, her dedication to her family, made him want to know her more, not as a business transaction, but as a person. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The quiet settled between them, not awkward, but filled with unspoken thoughts. Howard couldn't stop staring at her, still grappling with the fact that she looked so much like Margaret. He wondered if she noticed his discomfort, but Grace remained calm, sipping her coffee as if nothing was out of the ordinary. You're different from most businessmen I've met, Grace said suddenly, breaking the silence. Most would have pushed harder to get what they wanted. Howard smiled faintly, his eyes meeting hers. Maybe I'm tired of always getting what I want. Grace laughed softly, a sound that reminded him so much of Margaret it made his heart ache. Well, it's a nice change of pace. Howard nodded, though inside his thoughts were still tangled. He wasn't here for the farm, not really. He was here because of her, because of the way she stirred something inside him that he hadn't felt in years. It was unsettling, but also strangely comforting. For the first time in a long time, Howard felt something beyond the cold numbness that had consumed him since Margaret's death. But he couldn't stay here forever, sitting in Grace's kitchen and pretending everything made sense. He had a life to get back to, a business to run, and emotions he wasn't ready to face. I should be going, Howard said finally, standing up from the table. Grace looked at him, a little surprised by the suddenness of his decision. Are you sure? She asked. You drove all this way. You're welcome to stay a little longer if you'd like. The offer was tempting, more tempting than Howard wanted to admit, but he shook his head, forcing a polite smile. Thank you, but I have other matters to attend to. Grace nodded, standing as well. Well, if you ever find yourself back in Willow Creek, you're always welcome here. Howard paused, her words lingering in the air. He nodded once more before turning to leave, stepping out into the fading sunlight. As he walked back to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside him. Meeting Grace had stirred memories, emotions, and questions he wasn't sure he was ready to confront. But as he drove away from the farm, one thought kept running through his mind. He had to know more about her. Who she was, where she came from, and why she looked so much like the woman who had shaped his entire life. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Grace wasn't just a passing curiosity. She was the beginning of something he couldn't yet understand, and he wasn't ready to let it go. Days passed, but Howard couldn't stop thinking about Grace. The resemblance to Margaret haunted him, stirring memories he had buried long ago. His life, once governed by routine and business, felt disrupted by that one encounter. It was as though meeting Grace had opened a door to the past that he had kept firmly closed for years. At first, Howard tried to push the thoughts aside, bury himself in his work, and return to his usual rhythm. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Grace's face, heard her voice, and remembered the way her smile had reminded him of the happiness he'd lost with Margaret's death. It wasn't just her appearance that captivated him. It was the strength she carried, the warmth in her eyes, and the quiet resilience that he hadn't seen in anyone else since Margaret. It wasn't long before Howard found himself making excuses to return to Willow Creek. He told himself it was about business, that he wanted to look into other opportunities in the area, but deep down, he knew the truth. He wanted to see Grace again. On a crisp fall morning, he arrived at the farm once more. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a golden hue over the fields, and there was a faint chill in the air. As he parked his car, Howard noticed movement by the barn. Grace was out early, working as usual, and beside her was a young girl who couldn't have been more than 12 or 13 years old. She was laughing as she helped Grace lift a basket of apples into a cart, her energy infectious even from a distance. Howard approached slowly, unsure if he was intruding. Grace looked up, noticing him right away, and smiled, though this time there was a hint of surprise in her expression. "Mr. Caldwell," she called out, her voice warm but curious. "Back again." Howard nodded, trying to keep his tone casual. "I wanted to see how things were going. I was in the area." Grace didn't press him, though her eyes sparkled with a knowing look. "Well, it's good to see you. We're just finishing up with the morning chores." The young girl looked up at Howard, her big blue eyes wide with curiosity. She had Grace's energy, full of life and spirit. Howard guessed this must be Ellie, the niece Grace had mentioned during their first conversation. "This is Ellie," Grace said, confirming his thoughts. "My niece." Ellie smiled brightly at him. "Hi. Are you here to help with the farm?" Her question was innocent, her excitement infectious. Howard smiled back, though he wasn't sure how to answer. "Not exactly," he replied, his voice softer than usual. "But it looks like you're doing a great job already." Ellie beamed with pride at the compliment, then turned back to Grace. "Can I finish loading the apples by myself? I'm almost done." Grace nodded. "Go ahead, but be careful." As Ellie scampered off to finish the task, Grace turned her attention back to Howard. She seemed more relaxed this time, more open, as if their brief conversation during his last visit had built a small bridge of trust between them. "I hope you didn't come all this way just for business," Grace said with a smile. "It's a bit out of the way for most people." Howard chuckled softly, feeling some of his usual guardedness slip away. There was something about Grace's straightforwardness that put him at ease, even though being around her still stirred emotions he wasn't prepared to deal with. "Actually, I was hoping we could talk more about the farm," he said, though the words felt like a pretense even as he spoke them. "I'm interested in learning more about what you do here." Grace tilted her head, studying him for a moment before nodding. "Sure, I don't mind showing you around." They spent the next hour walking the property, with Grace explaining the ins and outs of running a small farm. Howard listened attentively, though his mind often wandered to the deeper questions swirling in his head. How was it possible that Grace looked so much like Margaret? Was there a connection, or was it just a cruel trick of fate? He didn't want to pry too much into her personal life, not yet, but he knew he couldn't stay in the dark for long. As they walked, Howard found himself opening up more than he expected. Grace's openness seemed to invite honesty, and before long, he was telling her about his own past, about Margaret, about how her death had left him hollow. "I'm sorry for your loss," Grace said quietly when he finished, her eyes full of genuine empathy. "I know how hard it is to lose someone you love." Howard nodded, grateful for her kindness but unsure how to respond. It wasn't something he was used to, talking about his pain with someone who understood it on a personal level. In the world of business, vulnerability was a weakness, but here, with Grace, it felt oddly natural. "What about you?" Howard asked, steering the conversation away from himself. "You've mentioned your niece, but not much about your own family." Grace hesitated for a moment, then sighed softly. "Ellie's my sister's daughter. My sister, Sarah, passed away a few years ago in an accident. Since then, it's just been me and Ellie." Howard could hear the weight in her voice, the quiet strength she had built from her own loss. He understood that feeling all too well, how grief could shape a person, harden them, yet also give them a certain resilience. "And your parents?" Howard asked gently. "They're gone too," Grace replied, her tone neutral. "I've been taking care of the farm ever since." Howard nodded, his heart aching for her. She had experienced more than her share of loss, yet here she was, still standing, still fighting to keep her family's legacy alive. It was a strength he deeply respected. "Ellie seems like a bright kid," Howard said, glancing over at the girl, who was now playing with a stray cat by the barn. "She is," Grace said with a smile. "She's been through a lot, but she's strong. She reminds me of Sarah sometimes." Howard could hear the love in Grace's voice, the way she spoke about Ellie with such care. It reminded him of the way Margaret had talked about starting a family someday. That dream had died with her, but standing here, watching Grace with her niece, Howard felt a pang of what might have been. As they continued their walk, Howard felt the questions in his mind building, but he held back. Now wasn't the time. He needed to earn Grace's trust, to understand her world better before he could ask the questions that truly mattered. As the weeks passed, Howard found himself returning to Willow Creek more often than he would have ever expected. His initial curiosity had turned into something more, a quiet, almost unspoken desire to be around Grace and Ellie. It felt strange at first, this pull toward the simplicity of their lives, so different from the cold, calculated world of business he was used to. But there was something about the farm, and more specifically, about Grace, that made him feel more alive than he had in years. Grace had opened up to him in ways that no one else had since Margaret's passing. The conversations they shared were genuine, free of the pretense and posturing he encountered in his daily business dealings. Here, on this small farm in a town barely on the map, Howard was just a man who had known loss, who was still searching for something he couldn't quite name. One evening, after another long day of walking the farm, Grace invited Howard to stay for dinner. It was a simple meal, roast chicken, potatoes, and fresh vegetables from the garden. But it was one of the best meals Howard had had in a long time. The house felt warm, full of life, with Ellie's laughter filling the room as she told stories from school. Howard listened, a quiet smile on his face, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something. "Do you cook often?" Grace asked, noticing the way he savored each bite. Howard chuckled. "Not really. I have people who handle that for me. This is much better than anything I'm used to." Grace smiled, her eyes lighting up with a mixture of amusement and pride. "Well, it's nothing fancy, but I'm glad you like it." Ellie, always curious, leaned in toward Howard. "What's it like being so rich? Do you have your own chef? Your own driver?" Howard laughed softly at her directness. "Yes, I suppose I do. But it's not as glamorous as it sounds. I spend most of my time in meetings or behind a desk. I don't get to enjoy the simple things as much as I'd like." "Simple things are the best," Ellie said, matter-of-factly, as if she were sharing a great truth with him. Howard couldn't help but agree, though it was something he hadn't realized until he started coming to Willow Creek. There was something about the simplicity of life here that made him question the importance of all the things he'd spent his life chasing. After dinner, they moved to the living room, where the conversation turned to lighter topics, stories from Grace's childhood on the farm, memories of her parents and sister. Howard found himself captivated by the ease with which Grace spoke about her past. Even when she talked about her losses, there was a grace in her voice, a quiet acceptance that resonated with him. He shared a few stories of his own, though he kept much of his past with Margaret private. It was still too painful, too raw, to talk about openly. But he found himself mentioning her in passing, a detail here, a memory there. Grace listened intently, never pushing him to say more than he was comfortable with. It was one of the things he appreciated most about her, her ability to be present, without demanding anything in return. As the night grew late, Howard realized how much time had passed. He stood, feeling a bit reluctant to leave but knowing he couldn't stay forever. "I should be going," he said, though his voice held a note of hesitation. Grace stood as well, walking him to the door. Ellie had already gone to bed, leaving the two of them alone in the quiet of the night. "You're welcome here any time, Howard," Grace said, her tone soft but sincere. "I mean that." He nodded, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you, Grace. I appreciate that." There was a brief moment of silence between them, a comfortable pause that didn't need to be filled with words. Howard looked at her, really looked at her, and once again, he was struck by how much she reminded him of Margaret. But it wasn't just her appearance anymore. It was something deeper. Grace had a strength, a resilience that was all her own. She wasn't Margaret, and yet, in some strange way, being around her made Howard feel closer to his late wife than he had in years. "I'll be back soon," Howard said, and he meant it. Grace smiled, a soft, knowing smile, as if she had already expected him to say that. "I'll be here." The drive back to Riverbend felt longer than usual. Howard's thoughts were filled with Grace, with the life she had built here in Willow Creek, and with the growing sense that his visits were becoming about more than just business or curiosity. There was something about being with Grace and Ellie that made him feel whole again, like he was part of a family, a feeling he hadn't experienced since losing Margaret. But even as he drove, a nagging question lingered in the back of his mind. The resemblance between Grace and Margaret was still too strong to ignore, and though he had tried to push it aside, it kept creeping back into his thoughts. Who was Grace, really? And why did she seem so connected to his past? A past she couldn't possibly know. Howard knew he needed to learn more, but for now, he was content to let things unfold naturally. Whatever the truth was, he would discover it in time. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, an unfamiliar but welcome feeling that had been absent from his life for too long. The next time Howard visited, it was mid-afternoon, and the autumn leaves had begun to change color, painting the landscape in rich hues of orange and red. Grace was working in the garden when he arrived, and she waved him over with a warm smile. "You're just in time," she called out as he approached. "I could use some help with these pumpkins." Howard grinned, rolling up his sleeves as he stepped into the garden. "I'm not much of a farmer, but I'll give it a shot." Together, they worked in the garden, side by side, pulling pumpkins from the vine and setting them aside for the upcoming harvest. It was physical work, but there was something satisfying about it, something grounding that Howard hadn't felt in a long time. As they worked, they talked, about everything and nothing. It was easy, natural, the kind of conversation that flowed without effort. As the afternoon wore on, Howard felt a sense of contentment that he hadn't known in years. Being here, with Grace and Ellie, felt like something more than just a distraction from his grief. It felt like the beginning of something new. And yet, beneath it all, the question of Grace's past still lingered. He didn't know when or how he would bring it up, but Howard knew that eventually he would have to confront it. For now, though, he was content to let things unfold in their own time, trusting that the answers would come when they were ready. As the weeks stretched on, Howard's visits to Willow Creek became a regular occurrence. Each time, he felt himself drawn deeper into Grace and Ellie's world, a world that felt so foreign and yet so comforting. His heart, long locked away behind walls of grief and isolation, was starting to soften, though he wasn't sure how to handle the shift. Being around Grace made him feel alive again, but it also stirred something else. Questions he couldn't ignore any longer. Howard had tried to push away the unsettling feeling that had lingered ever since he first laid eyes on Grace. The resemblance to Margaret was undeniable, and though he had spent countless hours convincing himself it was just a coincidence, the nagging suspicion had only grown stronger with time. He didn't want to believe there was more to it, but every time he looked at Grace, he felt like he was seeing a ghost. One morning, after another restless night, Howard sat at his desk in his office at Riverbend. His mind wasn't on work, though. His thoughts were consumed by Grace, by the questions swirling in his head, and by the need for answers that was slowly becoming impossible to ignore. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain calm and rational, but this situation was different. It was personal in a way that nothing had been since Margaret. He glanced at his phone, tempted to call one of his private investigators. Howard had always been thorough in business, never leaving anything to chance, and he had access to people who could find out anything he wanted to know. But something held him back. Investigating Grace felt wrong, like a betrayal of the trust they had been building. She had let him into her life, into Ellie's life, and to dig into her past behind her back felt dishonest. Still, the questions gnawed at him. Who was Grace? And how could she look so much like Margaret? Later that day, as Howard made his way back to Willow Creek, he found himself driving slower than usual, his mind a storm of doubts. He knew he had to confront this, but he didn't know how. He didn't want to jeopardize what was growing between him and Grace. But he also couldn't ignore the fact that there were too many unanswered questions. When he arrived at the farm, Grace was working in the barn, her hair pulled back and her sleeves rolled up as she fed the animals. Ellie was nearby, playing with a small flock of chickens, laughing as they pecked at the ground around her feet. The sight brought a rare smile to Howard's face, but the tension in his chest remained. "Hey there," Grace called out when she saw him approaching. She wiped her hands on a rag and walked over to meet him. "You're becoming a regular around here." Howard smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I guess I am. I like it here." Grace smiled back, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her gaze. "Everything all right? You seem a little distracted?" Howard hesitated. This was it. The moment he had been avoiding for weeks. He didn't want to bring it up, didn't want to ruin the easy rapport they had built. But the questions had grown too big to ignore. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Grace tilted her head slightly, her expression open and patient. "What is it?" Howard took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "The first time I saw you, I was struck by how much you look like someone I used to know." Grace's brow furrowed, a mix of confusion and curiosity crossing her face. "Someone you used to know?" "Yes," Howard replied. "My wife, Margaret." Grace blinked, clearly surprised by the admission. Howard had mentioned Margaret in passing before, but he had never gone into detail. This was the first time he had spoken her name so openly. "I don't understand," Grace said, her voice gentle but unsure. "You think I look like her?" Howard nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "Not just look like her. You're identical. I can't explain it. But ever since I met you, I've been trying to figure out how it's possible." Grace looked taken aback, her eyes widening slightly. She opened her mouth to respond, but then closed it again, clearly struggling to process what he was saying. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. I don't know what to say," Grace finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never heard anything like that before." Howard nodded, running a hand through his hair. "I know it sounds crazy. I've been trying to tell myself it's just a coincidence, but the resemblance is too strong, and now I can't stop wondering if there's more to it." Grace was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. She glanced toward Ellie, who was still playing with the chickens, oblivious to the tension in the air. "I don't know anything about your wife," Grace said slowly. "But I was adopted as a baby. I don't know much about my biological parents, other than the fact that my mother left me at an orphanage when I was born." Howard's heart skipped a beat. This was the first time Grace had mentioned being adopted, and it only deepened the mystery. He had no idea that her background was so complicated, but now everything seemed to fall into place in a way that made him feel both relieved and terrified. "Do you know anything about your mother?" Howard asked carefully. Grace shook her head. "Not really. The adoption records were sealed. I've never had any reason to look into it. My adoptive parents were wonderful, and I never felt the need to search for more." Howard nodded, though inside his mind was racing. Could it be possible? Could Grace be connected to Margaret in some way? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. He didn't know how to proceed, but he knew he couldn't leave this question unanswered. "Grace, I don't want to pry into your life," Howard said softly. "But I think there might be a connection between you and Margaret. I don't know what it is yet, but I think we need to find out." Grace's face was pale, her expression conflicted. She looked away for a moment, as if trying to gather her thoughts, then finally met his gaze again. "I don't know what to say, Howard," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "This is a lot to take in." Howard nodded, understanding her hesitation. "I know, and I don't want to push you into anything you're not comfortable with. But if there's a chance that you're connected to Margaret, I think we owe it to ourselves to find out the truth." Grace swallowed hard, clearly grappling with the weight of his words. She glanced over at Ellie once more, her protective instincts kicking in. Howard could see the fear in her eyes, the fear of the unknown, the fear of what this revelation might mean for her and Ellie. "I need time to think about this," Grace said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Howard nodded, his heart heavy. He had hoped for more, but he understood. This was a lot for anyone to process, and he couldn't expect Grace to have all the answers right away. "Take all the time you need," he said gently. "I'm not going anywhere." Grace gave him a small, uncertain smile, then turned back toward the barn. Howard watched her go, his heart aching with a mixture of hope and dread. He had finally opened the door to the truth, but he had no idea what lay on the other side. The next few days were quiet. Howard didn't return to Willow Creek, giving Grace the space she needed. He couldn't stop thinking about their conversation, though. The possibility that Grace might be connected to Margaret in ways he had never imagined consumed his every thought. It was as if all the answers to his questions were just out of reach, waiting for him to pull them into focus. Back at his office in Riverbend, Howard tried to concentrate on work, but everything seemed trivial compared to what was unfolding in Willow Creek. He couldn't help but wonder what Grace was thinking, whether she was curious about the connection, or if she was afraid of what the truth might bring. He had been prepared to investigate on his own, to hire someone to dig into her past, but something about doing that behind Grace's back didn't sit right with him. He wanted to give her the chance to come to him, to decide on her own terms how to move forward. One afternoon, as Howard was finishing a meeting, his phone buzzed with a text. It was from Grace. "Can we talk?" It read. Howard's heart skipped a beat. He immediately replied, setting everything else aside. "Of course, I can come to the farm." Grace's response was quick. "I'll be waiting." Howard left Riverbend without a second thought, driving toward Willow Creek with a sense of urgency he hadn't felt in years. He didn't know what Grace had decided, but he knew this conversation would change everything. He could feel it. When he arrived at the farm, the late afternoon sun was casting a golden glow over the fields, but the beauty of the scene did little to calm his nerves. Grace was waiting for him on the porch, her arms crossed and her expression pensive. She looked as though she hadn't slept well, her eyes shadowed with uncertainty. Howard stepped out of the car and walked toward her, the weight of the moment heavy between them. Neither of them spoke for a few seconds, the silence filled with unspoken questions. Finally, Grace gestured for him to sit with her on the porch steps. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Grace began quietly, her voice steady but tinged with hesitation. "About the possibility that I might be connected to your wife, Margaret." Howard nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "And?" Grace took a deep breath, looking out over the fields as if the wide-open space might somehow give her the answers she sought. "I want to know the truth," she said finally, her voice firm but fragile. "I've been thinking about it nonstop since we talked, and I can't let it go. If there's a chance that Margaret was my biological mother, I need to know." Howard felt a surge of relief and anxiety all at once. He had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, the enormity of what they were about to uncover felt overwhelming. He reached out, placing a hand on Grace's arm in a gesture of support. "Whatever the truth is, we'll face it together," he said softly. "I'm here for you, Grace. We'll figure this out." Grace gave him a small nod, her eyes betraying the turmoil she was feeling. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted. "I never looked into my biological parents before. I was happy with the family I had, and I never thought I'd need to dig into my past like this." "We'll start with what we know," Howard said, his voice steady. "I can help you get access to your adoption records. We can look into Margaret's past as well, see if there's anything that connects you to her." Grace looked at him, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "What if it's true?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if Margaret was my mother? What does that mean for us?" Howard had asked himself the same question many times. He didn't have a perfect answer, but he knew one thing for certain. "If it's true, it doesn't change how I feel about you. You're still Grace. You're still the woman I've come to care about. This doesn't have to change anything unless we let it." Grace bit her lip, looking down at her hands. "It changes everything, Howard. If Margaret was my mother, that means she gave me up. She kept me a secret. I don't know how to feel about that." Howard's heart ached at the pain in her voice. He knew how hard it was to confront the truth about the people you loved. "Margaret never mentioned anything to me about having a child," he said quietly. "If she did give you up, there's a reason we don't know yet. We can't make any assumptions until we have all the facts." Grace nodded slowly, but her expression was still conflicted. "I don't know if I'm ready for what we might find. But I can't live in this uncertainty either. I need to know who I am." Howard understood that feeling all too well. He had spent years grappling with the void left by Margaret's death, and now it seemed like the answers he had been seeking might come from the most unexpected place. They spent the next few days putting together the pieces of the puzzle. Howard used his resources to pull strings, and soon they had access to Grace's adoption records. The process took time, too much time for Howard's liking, but eventually, they received the documents they needed. The day the documents arrived, Howard and Grace sat side by side at the farmhouse kitchen table, the weight of what they were about to uncover heavy between them. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope, her breath shallow with anticipation. Howard watched as her eyes scanned the papers, her face paling with each passing moment. Finally, she set the documents down on the table, her fingers trembling as she pointed to one particular line. "It's her," Grace whispered, her voice barely audible. "Margaret. She was my mother." Howard's heart stopped for a moment, his mind reeling. The truth was out in the open now, a truth he had never expected to find. Grace wasn't just someone who looked like Margaret. She was Margaret's daughter, her flesh and blood. The room felt impossibly quiet as Howard processed the revelation. Grace's eyes were filled with a mixture of disbelief and pain, her expression betraying the storm of emotions that had been unleashed by the truth. "She gave me up," Grace said softly, her voice cracking with emotion. "She had me, and she gave me away." Howard reached for her hand, his heart breaking at the sight of her pain. "Grace, I don't know why Margaret did what she did, but I know she loved you. There must have been a reason. Maybe she thought she didn't have a choice." Grace shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "But she never told you. She kept it from you too." Howard nodded slowly, the weight of that realization hitting him hard. Margaret had kept this secret from him for all those years. The woman he had loved, the woman he had mourned, had carried a burden he never knew about. "I don't know why she kept this from me," Howard said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "But we'll figure it out, Grace. We'll find the answers." Grace's tears fell freely now, her shoulders shaking with the weight of it all. Howard pulled her into a gentle embrace, holding her as she wept. The truth had been revealed, but the questions it raised were just beginning. As they sat together in the quiet farmhouse, Howard knew that their lives had changed forever. The bond between him and Grace had deepened, but it had also become more complicated than he had ever imagined. They were connected now, not just by circumstance, but by blood. A truth that would shape the rest of their lives. The air in the farmhouse felt thick with tension. Grace had barely spoken since they discovered the truth, the revelation that Margaret was her biological mother weighing heavily on both of them. Howard couldn't stop replaying the moment over in his mind, seeing Grace's hands tremble as she pointed to that line in the adoption record, the quiet agony in her eyes as the reality of her connection to Margaret sank in. The following days were marked by an uncomfortable silence. Howard visited the farm daily, but the easy rhythm that had developed between him and Grace was gone. He could feel the distance growing between them, and it terrified him. They had uncovered the truth, but instead of bringing them closer, it seemed to be pulling them apart. One morning, as Howard sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, Grace joined him, her expression unreadable. The sun was just beginning to rise over the fields, casting a soft golden light across the land. It should have been a peaceful moment, but the tension between them made the silence feel unbearable. "I've been thinking a lot," Grace said quietly, breaking the stillness. Howard set his coffee down and turned to her, his heart racing. He had been waiting for this conversation, dreading it and hoping for it in equal measure. "I can only imagine," he replied, his voice careful, trying to gauge where her thoughts were leading. Grace looked out over the horizon, her gaze distant. "I've been trying to make sense of all of this. Why Margaret gave me up. Why she kept it a secret. I've been angry, hurt, and confused. I don't know how to process it all." Howard felt a pang in his chest. He had hoped that discovering the truth would bring Grace some closure, but it was clear that it had only opened more wounds. "You have every right to feel that way, Grace," he said gently. "I can't begin to imagine what it's like for you." Grace nodded, her eyes still fixed on the distant fields. "I keep asking myself why she didn't tell anyone. Not you, not me. Why would she keep something like this a secret?" Howard had asked himself the same question 100 times since they uncovered the truth. Why hadn't Margaret told him? Why had she kept such a monumental part of her life hidden? He had loved her more than anything, but now he was faced with the realization that there was a side of her he had never known. "I don't have an answer," Howard said softly, his voice filled with regret. "But I wish I did." Grace sighed, finally turning to face him. Her eyes were filled with pain. But there was also a quiet determination there, a need for closure that went beyond the shock of the discovery. "I want to know the whole story, Howard. I need to know why she gave me up. There has to be more to it." Howard nodded slowly. He understood Grace's need for answers, and he wanted them too. But there was a part of him that was afraid of what they might find. Margaret had kept this secret for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it had the power to reshape everything he thought he knew about her. "How do you want to go about this?" Howard asked, his voice gentle but firm. He wanted Grace to lead the way, to decide how far they would dig into Margaret's past. Grace was quiet for a moment, her brow furrowed in thought. "I don't know. I've been thinking about contacting the adoption agency, seeing if they have any more information about why I was given up. Maybe they have records or something." Howard nodded. That's a good place to start." There was a brief silence, and then Grace looked at him, her eyes softening. "I don't want you to feel like this changes anything between us, Howard. I've been distant, and I'm sorry for that. It's just overwhelming." Howard's heart swelled at her words, relief washing over him. He had been so afraid that the truth would drive a wedge between them, that Grace would pull away and shut him out completely. But here she was, acknowledging the difficulty of the situation and offering him a chance to stay by her side. "It's all right, Grace," Howard said, his voice steady. "I understand, and I'm here for you, no matter what. We'll figure this out together." Grace smiled faintly, the tension between them easing slightly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They were still navigating the aftermath of the revelation, but at least they were doing it together. The following week, Grace took the first steps in reaching out to the adoption agency. Howard had offered to help, but she insisted on handling it herself, wanting to take control of the process. She was determined to uncover the truth on her own terms, and Howard respected that. While they waited for a response from the agency, the days at the farm continued as usual. Howard found himself helping out more and more, assisting Grace with the daily tasks that kept the place running. There was something calming about the work, something that made him feel grounded in a way he hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, as they worked in the garden, Grace spoke up. "I've been thinking about Ellie." Howard looked over at her, surprised. "What about her?" Grace wiped her hands on a towel, glancing toward the barn where Ellie was playing. "I've been trying to figure out how to tell her about all of this. She's been asking questions, wondering why I've been so distracted." Howard felt a pang of sympathy. Ellie was young, but she was sharp. It was only a matter of time before she started asking more direct questions. "Do you think she's ready to know?" Grace sighed, her expression troubled. "I don't know. She's lost so much already. Her mother, her grandparents. I don't want to burden her with more than she can handle." Howard nodded, understanding the delicate balance Grace was trying to maintain. "Maybe you don't need to tell her everything right now," he suggested. "You could start by explaining that you've learned something new about your past, but you don't have all the answers yet." Grace considered his words for a moment, then nodded. "Maybe you're right. I just don't want her to feel like I'm keeping secrets from her." "You're protecting her," Howard said gently, "and that's what matters." Grace smiled at him, her eyes softening with gratitude. "Thank you, Howard, for everything. I don't know how I'd be handling all of this without you." Howard felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. "You're stronger than you think, Grace. You'd be handling it just fine. But I'm glad I'm here to help." As the days passed, the tension that had weighed so heavily on them began to lift. Grace seemed more at ease, more open, and Howard felt their bond growing stronger. They didn't have all the answers yet, but they were facing the uncertainty together. Then, one evening, the phone rang. Grace answered it, her expression unreadable as she listened to the voice on the other end. Howard watched her carefully, his heart racing with anticipation. After a few moments, Grace hung up the phone and turned to him, her face pale. "That was the adoption agency," she said quietly. Howard's pulse quickened. "And—" Grace took a deep breath, her voice trembling as she spoke. "They found some records. Margaret. She didn't want to give me up. Her family forced her to." Howard's heart clenched at the revelation. "Forced her?" Grace nodded, tears welling in her eyes. She was young, unmarried, and her family, they didn't want the scandal. They made her give me up. Howard felt a wave of emotion wash over him. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and with it came a deeper understanding of Margaret's pain she had carried in silence for all those years. Grace's voice shook as she continued. "She didn't abandon me, Howard. She didn't want to give me up." Howard reached for her, pulling her into a tight embrace. He could feel the weight of her relief, the flood of emotions she had been holding back. They had uncovered the truth, and while it didn't erase the pain of the past, it brought them both a sense of closure. As they stood together in the quiet farmhouse, Howard knew that their journey wasn't over. There were still questions to answer, still emotions to untangle, but for now they had each other, and that was enough. The truth about Margaret had been uncovered, but even with the revelations, Grace struggled to find peace. While it was comforting to know that her biological mother hadn't abandoned her out of indifference, the knowledge that Margaret had been forced to give her up only deepened the complexity of Grace's emotions. She felt a mix of relief, anger, and sadness, each one competing for space in her heart. For the next few days, Grace kept to herself, processing everything in her own quiet way. Howard gave her the space she needed, though he couldn't help but worry about her. He understood that she needed time, but the distance between them felt like a painful reminder of how fragile their connection still was. He was used to solving problems with swift action, but this was different. Emotions couldn't be fixed overnight, and patience was something he wasn't good at when it came to matters of the heart. One afternoon, Howard decided to visit the farm, unsure of how Grace would receive him. He had spent the last few days agonizing over whether or not his presence would help or hurt, but the need to check on her, to offer some kind of comfort, outweighed his hesitation. As he pulled into the familiar driveway, he spotted Grace sitting on the front porch, her posture tense, her eyes distant as she stared out at the fields. Howard approached slowly, his footsteps soft on the wooden steps. "Grace?" he called gently. She looked up, her expression weary but not unkind. "Howard," she said, her voice soft, though the warmth that had once colored it was absent. She offered a small smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I wanted to check on you," Howard said, sitting down beside her on the porch. "I've been worried." Grace sighed, pulling her knees up to her chest and resting her chin on them. "I'm okay," she said, though Howard could hear the unspoken weight behind her words. She wasn't okay, not really, but she didn't know how to articulate what she was feeling. "I've just been thinking a lot." Howard nodded, unsure of what to say. He could sense the distance between them, and it unnerved him. Before, their conversations had flowed easily, but now everything felt strained. "I understand," he said after a pause. "You've had a lot to process." Grace nodded, biting her lip. "I know Margaret didn't abandon me out of choice, but I still feel like she's a stranger to me. And I guess that's what hurts the most. She's my mother, but I'll never get to know her. I'll never get to ask her why. I'll never get to hear her side of the story." Howard's heart ached at the sadness in her voice. He had known Margaret as a wife, a partner, but Grace had been denied the chance to know her as a mother. "I wish I could give you that," he said quietly. "I wish I could fill in the gaps, but even I didn't know this side of her." Grace let out a bitter laugh, though it wasn't directed at him. "She kept so much hidden, even from you. I can't help but wonder if she ever thought about me, or if I was just an inconvenience she was forced to forget." "She thought about you," Howard said firmly. "I know she did. Margaret carried a lot of pain with her, but I see now that some of that pain was because of you. She never talked about it. But there were moments, small moments, where I could see she was hurting in ways I couldn't understand. Now I know why." Grace was quiet for a long time, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "It just feels so unfair," she whispered. "I spent my whole life wondering who I was, where I came from. And now that I finally know, it's too late to do anything about it. Margaret's gone, and I'm left with all these questions that will never be answered." Howard swallowed hard, wishing there was something more he could do. He had never felt so powerless. "I know it's not the same," he began cautiously, "but you still have me. I know I'm not Margaret, but I care about you, Grace. More than I can put into words." Grace turned to him, her eyes softening for the first time in days. "I care about you too, Howard. I need time. This is all so much. I don't know how to move forward yet." Howard nodded, trying to hide the sting of her words. He had expected this, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. "Take all the time you need," he said gently, though the fear of losing her gnawed at him. Grace sighed deeply, running a hand through her hair. "It's not just about Margaret, it's about us too. I've been thinking about what this all means for us, and I don't know if I can be what you need right now." The words hit Howard like a punch to the gut. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice low. Grace looked down at her hands, her expression conflicted. "I don't want to hurt you, Howard, but I'm not sure I'm ready for this, for us. There's too much I need to figure out, and I don't think I can do that while trying to navigate a relationship with you." Howard felt his chest tighten. He had known Grace was struggling, but he hadn't expected her to pull away like this. "Grace, I understand that you need time, but I don't want to lose you." Grace's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "You're not losing me. I need to be alone for a while. I need to figure out who I am, where I come from, and what all of this means. I can't do that if I'm constantly worried about how my decisions are affecting you." Howard sat in silence, trying to process her words. He understood her need for space, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. He had grown close to her, had started to imagine a future with her, and now she was telling him that she wasn't ready for any of it. "I won't stand in your way," Howard said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "If you need time, I'll give it to you. But please, don't shut me out completely." Grace nodded, wiping away a stray tear. "I won't, I promise. I just need to figure things out on my own for a while." Howard wanted to say more, wanted to convince her that they could work through this together. But he knew that pushing her would only drive her further away. So, he simply nodded, forcing himself to accept her decision, even though it felt like his heart was breaking. They sat in silence for a long time, the distance between them palpable. Howard knew that this wasn't the end, not yet, but it felt like a step backward, a painful reminder that sometimes, no matter how much you care for someone, you can't control their journey. Grace needed to find her own way, and Howard could only hope that, in time, their paths would cross again. As the sun began to set over the farm, Howard stood to leave, his chest heavy with unspoken words. Grace stood too, walking him to his car in silence. There was no need for a goodbye, no need for promises. They both knew that this was just the beginning of a long, uncertain road. As Howard drove away, the familiar landscape of Willow Creek fading in his rearview mirror, he felt a deep, aching sense of loss. Grace needed time, and he would give her that. But as he drove back to Riverbend, he couldn't help but wonder if time would bring them back together, or if it would only push them further apart. The days that followed were some of the longest Howard had ever known. Without his regular trips to Willow Creek, his life in Riverbend returned to its familiar routine, but everything felt hollow. His work, once a distraction from his grief, now felt pointless. The meetings, the phone calls, the deals, none of it mattered. All Howard could think about was Grace. Her absence left a void that was impossible to fill. Every time he glanced at his phone, he hoped for a message from her, some sign that she was ready to talk again. But the days stretched into weeks, and there was nothing. Howard knew he had to give her the space she needed, but the waiting was agony. He replayed their last conversation over and over in his mind, wondering if there was something he could have said or done differently. The fear of losing her for good gnawed at him constantly. One late afternoon, just as Howard was about to leave the office, his phone buzzed. His heart skipped a beat when he saw Grace's name on the screen. "Can we talk?" the message read. It was the same words she had sent him before, but this time they carried a different weight. Howard didn't hesitate. "I'll come to the farm," he replied. The drive to Willow Creek felt different this time. There was a heaviness in his chest, a sense that everything was about to change. He didn't know what Grace wanted to say, but he was ready for whatever it was. He had spent weeks preparing himself for the possibility that she might still need more time, or worse, that she might decide they were better off apart. But Howard knew he couldn't live in limbo forever. Whatever Grace had to say, he was ready to face it head-on. When he pulled up to the farm, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden light over the fields. Grace was waiting for him on the porch, just like before, but this time there was a softness in her expression, a quiet vulnerability that made Howard's heart ache. As he approached, Grace stood up, offering him a tentative smile. "Thanks for coming," she said, her voice soft. Howard nodded, his pulse quickening. "Of course. I've been waiting for you to reach out." They stood there for a moment, the tension between them palpable but different from before. Grace gestured for him to sit with her on the porch steps, just like they had done so many times before. Howard sat beside her, the familiar creak of the wooden steps grounding him as he waited for her to speak. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Grace began, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "About everything. About Margaret. About my past. About us." Howard's heart raced, but he kept his expression calm. He didn't want to rush her, didn't want to push her into saying something she wasn't ready to. He just nodded, waiting for her to continue. "I've been angry," Grace admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "Angry at Margaret for keeping me a secret. Angry at myself for not looking for answers sooner. And angry at you, even though I know none of this is your fault." Howard's chest tightened at her words. "I'm sorry, Grace. I wish I could take that anger away, but I understand why you feel that way." Grace shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "That's just it, Howard. I've been holding on to this anger because it was easier than facing the truth. But the truth is, I've been scared. Scared of what this all means. Scared of getting close to you and finding out that I might lose you, just like I lost my family." Howard's heart broke at her confession. He had suspected as much, but hearing her say it out loud made the weight of her fears all the more real. "You won't lose me, Grace," he said gently. "I'm here. I've always been here." Grace nodded, wiping away a tear. "I know, and I realize now that I've been pushing you away because I was afraid of letting myself need you. After everything I've been through, it just felt safer to keep my distance." Howard reached for her hand, his touch light but reassuring. "You don't have to do this alone, Grace. You've been through so much, and I understand if you need time, but I want to be there for you. I want to help you carry this burden." Grace looked down at their joined hands, her grip tightening slightly. "I've realized something," she said softly. "The more I pushed you away, the more I hurt myself. I care about you, Howard. I care about you more than I thought I could care about anyone. And that scares me, but I don't want to live in fear anymore." Howard's breath caught in his throat. He had been waiting for this moment, hoping for it. But now that it was here, he found himself at a loss for words. All the fear, the uncertainty, the pain of the past few weeks melted away, replaced by a deep sense of relief. "I care about you too, Grace," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've never stopped. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that I want you in it. Whatever we face, we'll face it together." Grace smiled through her tears, her heart in her eyes. "I want that too." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their emotions settling between them like a fragile peace. Howard felt the tension that had been building inside him for weeks finally begin to ease. It wasn't a perfect resolution. There was still so much they needed to work through, so many unanswered questions, but they had taken the first step toward healing, and that was enough for now. After a few moments, Grace spoke again, her voice steadier. "I've also been thinking about Margaret," she said, her eyes distant as she looked out at the fields. I spent so long feeling angry at her, but now, I think I understand. She didn't have a choice. Her family forced her to give me up, and she must have carried that pain with her for the rest of her life. I can't be angry at her for that." Howard nodded, his chest tightening at the thought of Margaret's silent suffering. "She loved you, Grace. I'm sure of that. If she could have found a way to keep you, she would have." Grace smiled sadly. "I know. And that's why I've decided to forgive her. I don't want to carry this anger with me any longer. It's time to let it go." Howard felt a surge of pride for Grace, admiring her strength and resilience. Forgiving Margaret was a monumental step, and it was one that would allow Grace to heal from the wounds of the past. "I'm proud of you," Howard said quietly. "Margaret would be too." Grace smiled at him, her eyes soft with gratitude. "Thank you, Howard, for everything. I don't know how I would have gotten through this without you." Howard squeezed her hand gently, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over him. "You're stronger than you think, Grace. You would have made it through, no matter what. But I'm glad I could be here for you." They sat together on the porch as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields. The air was cool, but the warmth between them was palpable. For the first time in a long time, Howard felt a sense of hope for the future, hope for the life they could build together. Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, her breath soft and steady. "I don't know what's going to happen next," she said quietly, "but I'm not afraid anymore. We'll figure it out, won't we?" Howard smiled, his heart full. "Yes, we will. Together." The chill of early winter had started to settle over Willow Creek, but inside the farmhouse, there was a warmth that filled every corner. Howard stood at the window, watching as Grace and Ellie worked together outside, preparing the garden for the colder months. Ellie's laughter carried through the air, mixing with the soft murmur of Grace's voice, and Howard couldn't help but smile. It had been weeks since their conversation on the porch, and in that time, everything had begun to shift. The weight of the past no longer pressed so heavily on them, and Grace had started to come to terms with the truth about Margaret. She had forgiven her biological mother, and in doing so had found a kind of peace Howard had never thought possible. The anger and confusion had faded, replaced by acceptance, and though the pain of what had been lost would never fully go away, they had both learned how to live with it. Howard turned from the window as Grace and Ellie entered the house, their cheeks flushed from the cold. Grace smiled at him, her eyes warm and full of the quiet contentment that had become so familiar in recent weeks. "You should have come out and helped," Grace teased, pulling off her gloves and hanging up her coat. "It would have done you some good to get your hands dirty." Howard chuckled. "I think I've done enough manual labor for one lifetime, don't you think?" Ellie grinned as she kicked off her boots. "You're lucky you have us to keep the farm running," she said, her tone full of playful pride. Howard smiled warmly at her. "I'm very lucky indeed." The house felt different now. There was a lightness to it, a sense of home that Howard hadn't experienced in years. The emptiness that had haunted him for so long had been replaced with something far better. A family, Grace, Ellie, and the simple, quiet life they shared had filled the void left by Margaret's death. And while Howard knew he could never forget the past, he was finally ready to move forward. As they gathered around the kitchen table for dinner, Howard found himself watching Grace, the way her eyes sparkled when she laughed, the way she and Ellie moved so naturally together, their bond strong and unbreakable. This was what he had been missing for so long: connection, warmth, and the feeling of belonging that had been absent from his life since Margaret's passing. And now, for the first time, Howard felt like he had found his way back to it. After dinner, as Ellie excused herself to work on a school project, Howard and Grace lingered at the table. The evening had settled into a comfortable quiet, the kind that only comes when two people have found peace with each other. Grace took a deep breath, her hand resting on Howard's. "I've been thinking," she began softly, her voice full of the thoughtful tone he had come to love, "about what comes next." Howard looked at her, his heart steady but full of anticipation. "What do you mean?" Grace smiled, her eyes soft with emotion. "About us. About what we want for the future." Howard's chest tightened, but this time it wasn't with fear or doubt. It was with hope. "I've been thinking about that too," he admitted. "And I want to be here, with you, for as long as you'll have me." Grace's smile widened, her fingers tightening around his. "I want that too, Howard. I've spent so much of my life running from the things that scared me, being alone, facing the truth about my past, but I don't want to run anymore. I want to build something with you, something real." Howard felt a surge of emotion rise in his chest. "You don't know how much that means to me, Grace. I've spent so many years feeling like my life was over, like I'd never find happiness again. But you've given me hope. You've given me a reason to believe in the future again." Grace's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her smile never wavered. "You've done the same for me. I never thought I'd find someone who could understand me the way you do, who could see all my broken pieces and still want to be a part of my life." Howard reached across the table, taking both of her hands in his. "We're both a little broken, Grace, but maybe that's why we fit together." They sat there for a moment, the silence between them filled with the unspoken promise of what was to come. They had both been through so much: loss, heartache, and the kind of pain that reshaped a person. But now, they had found each other, and together, they were building something new, something that would last. "I want to make this work," Grace said softly, her eyes filled with determination. "I want us to be a family." Howard's heart swelled at her words. "We already are." The next few months passed in a blur of quiet moments and shared laughter. Howard spent more and more time at the farm, helping Grace with the day-to-day tasks, learning the rhythm of life in Willow Creek. It was different from anything he had ever known, but it felt right in a way he couldn't explain. For the first time in years, Howard wasn't thinking about the past or worrying about the future. He was simply living in the present, surrounded by the people he cared about most. As winter settled in, the farmhouse became a place of warmth and comfort, the crackling of the fireplace and the smell of homemade meals filling the air. Ellie's laughter echoed through the halls, and Grace's presence brought a sense of peace. Howard had thought he would never find again. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Grace leaned against Howard, her head resting on his shoulder. The quiet crackle of the flames filled the room, and Howard felt a deep sense of contentment wash over him. "I can't believe how much has changed," Grace murmured, her voice soft but full of wonder. "A year ago, I didn't even know where I came from, and now I have a family, a real family." Howard pressed a kiss to the top of her head, his heart full. "You've always had a family, Grace. You just didn't know it." Grace smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm so glad you found me." Howard's chest tightened with emotion. "I'm glad too. I never thought I'd feel this way again, Grace. But you've changed everything." They sat in silence for a moment, the warmth of the fire and the closeness between them all the comfort they needed. Howard knew there would be challenges ahead. There always were. But he wasn't afraid. Not anymore. They had faced the truth, uncovered the past, and now they were building a future together. And for the first time in years, Howard felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. As the fire crackled and the winter wind howled softly outside, Howard pulled Grace closer, his heart steady with the knowledge that they had both found their way home. Together,